we invite you for the plenary session, Russia and the West. If it's not a Cold War, then what is it? Is the clash between Russia and the West about geography or also ideology? Is great power politics back on the international table? What does the conflict between Russia and the West spell for Central and Eastern Europe?
Katarzyna, and I can think of no better way to honor Jim Denton's memory than with such a great panel that we've managed to assemble here, and I wanted to invite each of them to the stage. First, the man who I like to call the only real MP in a fake parliament, Ilya Ponomarev, was a member of the State Duma from 2007 to 2016, and as I don't have to tell everybody in this room, was the one and only vote against the illegal annexation of Crimea, and we all respect him deeply for that. Second. The next man I wanted to introduce is somebody who I've been on so many panels with that now I can finally pronounce his name. Robert Pshel is a senior officer on Russia in the Western Balkans for NATO, and prior to that he had the hardest job in the world, and that was being the NATO rep in Moscow, if you can imagine how hard a job that is. Next, I'd like to ask Celeste Wallander, the President and CEO of the U.S.-Russia Foundation, who served in the National Security Council and was a senior advisor to President Barack Obama. And Bobo Lowe, who on your program it just says independent analyst, which I think is ridiculously modest. Anybody who knows Bobo knows he's one of the sharpest minds on Russia. He's the author of the books Russia in the New World Disorder and also a Wary Embrace, which is about the Sino-Russian relationship. Bobo? And last but certainly not least, somebody whose name I hope I pronounced properly, Vygaudas Uzauskas, the former foreign minister of Lithuania and the former ambassador to the of the European Union to Russia. Just by way of a brief introduction, I'd like to say not only am I proud of this panel we've put together, I'm proud of the title of it. If this isn't a Cold War, then what is it? Because this is kind of a ridiculous semantic debate that we've all been having for the last decade or so. And sometimes it gets into some ridiculous things like, well, there's not a wall in Berlin, so it can't be a Cold War. Well, I mean, what I wanted to do with this panel was to kind of leave the semantics of this aside. We could call it a Cold War, we could not call it a Cold War, that doesn't really matter. But what I want to get at in this panel is, what is this conflict between Russia and the West about? What are we fighting about? And second, and just as importantly, what is at stake in this conflict? And to get us rolling, I'll just give very briefly, and I promise very briefly, my own observations on what I think we're looking at, just as a way of framing this. I do see an ideological struggle, but it's a much more fluid ideological struggle than the struggle we had during the Cold War. I see not two hermetically sealed systems like we had in the Cold War competing with each other, but two systems that are deeply integrated with each other, which makes the struggle a lot more complicated. We see an asymmetry in the balance of power in favor of the West. Russia, after all, has a GDP less than the US state of Texas. But yet we have a Russia that is very skilled at playing asymmetrical warfare against the West. And what we basically have, I see, are three conflicts going on at the same time. One is a normative struggle between two systems of governance. One to the West that's based on all the things we hold near and dear: the rule of law, the rights of the individual, the sanctity of contracts, accountability, transparency. And one to the East, which is based on a different, although coherent, set of principles: kleptocracy, cronyism, the the subordination of the law to power. So we have this struggle of governance that is going on. We also have two visions of what the international system should look like. We have a Western system which is based on rules. We've all said till we're blue in the face, the rules-based liberal Western international order, the rules-based liberal international order. If I had $1 for every time I said that, I could retire tomorrow. We have another system, though, and I like to say Putin wants to party like it's 1815. Another vision that sees the world dominated by great powers, in which smaller powers are mere appendages or protectorates of said great powers. And finally, and just as importantly, we have an ideological struggle within Western societies themselves, between the traditional liberal notions of governance and a populist insurgency, and we have the Russian Federation attempting to exploit that internal struggle. As far as what's at stake, first and foremost, the sovereignty of small states. First and foremost, the sovereignty of small states. What the rules-based liberal Western order means to me is that small states have rights. The sovereignty of little Estonia is no less sacrosanct than the sovereignty of the United States of America. But the other vision of the international order has a very different view of the sovereignty of small states. Secondly, the health and viability of our democratic institutions themselves. And there's a flip side to this that's positive, because this struggle could be the impetus for us to improve our governance. And if we do this right, we'll come out of this with better governance and more security at the same time. And finally, the stability of the international system, because this much vaunted multipolar world order that Russia and China say they want, history teaches us that such multipolar orders are inherently unstable, and that rules-based orders are actually much more stable. So with that, I'll shut up and turn it over to our distinguished panelists. Let's start with you, Bobo. What are we fighting about, and what is at stake?
Sure. Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you for having me here. I agree with you about the overemphasis on semantics. Labels here don't matter. Reality does. And the prime reality today is that Russia and the West are engaged in a multi-dimensional struggle. I would indeed call it a confrontation. This confrontation is political, it's geopolitical, it's ideological, as Brian mentioned, and it's about conflicting visions of security and, of course, the world order, as you were talking about. Unfortunately, this confrontation is going to get much worse before it gets better. The US intention to withdraw from the INF Treaty is merely the latest blow to some kind of practical accommodation between Russia and the West. We've heard a lot at this conference and at many conferences around the world about the coming confrontation between, the coming war indeed, between China and the United States. And yet I believe that the divide between Russia and the West is starker, it's more fundamental, and it's more likely to lead to military conflict. People try and take comfort in that Russia's a declining power, it's weak. Yes, it is in many respects, but its decline will be messy and most likely violent. I think the Trump gambit, which is a kind of ersatz strength through peace through strength, but really is deal-making through intimidation, this will not work with Putin's Russia. Over the next few years, we're going to see no substantive changes to Russian foreign policy. What Brian was talking about, this world order which is dominated by great powers, Russia sees itself as an independent center of global power, no less important and with no less status than the United States and China. Now, of course, Putin will be tactically flexible. He will mix intimidation, he will mix bluff, he will actually present a reasonable face on many occasions. But we should not kid ourselves that the strategic goals will change. And what really worries me, perhaps more than anything else, is it's not that anyone wants a war. No one wants a war. But in this environment, in this climate, the chances of misperception, miscalculation, and on the Russian side, very much overconfidence are considerable. And it's these sorts of things that lead to bloody military conflict. Now, can I just say a quick word about the the Russia-China partnership? Again, it seems to me that the White House, the Trump White House, believes that they can somehow split the Chinese and Russians. No, they're not. In fact, I would argue that the Trump administration's behavior has actually pushed them together. Not because Beijing shares necessarily Moscow's view of the world, but because they see their relationship, rightly or wrongly, as one of the few stable elements in an increasingly unstable war. However, the Sino-Russian relationship is not an alliance, as some people argue. There are crucial differences in their worldviews, and we can come to that later. So, despite appearances, the Sino-Russian partnership is actually rather less than the sum of its parts. We should be worried about Russia. We should be worried about the rise of China. But China and Russia together have a kind of, funnily enough, a mutually diminishing impact. Now, what should the West do? Well, there are, of course, many things that the West can do to meet the Russia challenge. But ultimately, the key lies in sorting out our own problems. We need to demonstrate that the liberal world order, that liberal values, these are not merely virtuous, but these are the most effective means and most effective interests in instruments going around. And so we need to address core problems in Europe about the rule of law, about xenophobic nationalism, sustainable development, and widening inequality. Because the bottom line is this: unless we fix ourselves, we have no hope, and indeed no moral right, to fix anyone or anything else.
No, I couldn't agree more with that, Bobo. And actually, you touched on one of my favorite topics here. Is that we do have to get much better about telling our Western story and to living up to our Western values. And one of the virtues, one of the good things that might come out of this conflict, is that we might get better governance in the bargain for greater security at the same time, if we're smart as we approach this. I'm going to move on to Ilya now, and I mean, Ilya, it's if people like you were running Russia, people like me would be out of business in a lot of ways. But
well, you can join our government. Don't worry.
We wouldn't be having panels like this. But how do you see this? How do you see this? What are we fighting about, and what is at stake from your perspective?
Brian, we have discussed this before. I think it's outrageous even to ask this question what it is. Because for me, it is war without any adjectives. For me, I know that 25,000 of my compatriots perished during the last 4 years. 11,000 on the Ukrainian side, and God knows how many, but definitely more on the side of the aggression. 1.5 million displaced people on the Ukrainian side, and almost 1 million on the side of Russia. And this is a crime. This is a crime that was initiated by Kremlin. This is a crime where my friends are dying every day. 10 of my close personal friends died during the last 5 years from the hands of murderers. I was approached by an assassin in Kiev. I have to move in Kiev with a platoon of bodyguards. One of my friends was shot literally less than 100 meters from where I was. So it is war. And I think it is a usual Western hypocrisy of recent days to question this. Is it a war or is it not a war? We shouldn't question this. We should fight it. And many people are fighting it, while others pretending that there is no fight. And we are to fight it on every occasion. It is about energy. It is about propaganda. It is about a direct military fight. The only thing that I know for sure, and I don't want to speak long because I want the audience to be engaged with us. It's the last session. But I know how this war would end. And I think that everybody in the Russian elite, which is right now supporting this war, also know how this war would end. Every day in their bathrooms, when I come into a mirror and looking at this mirror, they see a confirmation that we all are part of the same Western world. We are not part of China. We are not part of India. We are part of one civilization, which was born in one time. And that's why I don't know when that would happen, but I know how that would happen. That would happen that we all will be living in one alliance. And it's vitally important, not only for Ukraine, for Europe. It's vitally important for my country, for Russia, that this alliance would take place. I'm not sure whether Russia would sustain itself as it is right now after Putin is gone. And he is inevitably gone. He is a mortal being. But I'm afraid very much that when he would be leaving us, and maybe leaving this world, that would result in new wave of disintegration processes in Russia. The only way how Russians can preserve themselves as Russian is being in alliance with Europe and the United States. And this is what inevitably would happen.
So like me, Ilya, you sound temporarily pessimistic but metaphysically optimistic, which I think is a pretty healthy place to be. Robert, you're in a sense on the front lines of this as well in NATO. How does this look from your perspective? What are we fighting about? And what is at stake in this fight?
Well, I think I have to start with by saying certain things which I'm kind of work-wise obliged to say, because I haven't had the opportunity. I'm a NATO representative after all here, right? Well, in a way, I guess it will sound a bit like I am disagreeing somewhat with the previous speakers, or the answers which I understood they gave to your question about the Cold War definition. For NATO, we are not in a Cold War, and we don't want to be in a Cold War. And there are a number of reasons for it. I owe enormous respect, Ilya, to Ukraine, your own experiences, and we are trying to show our support in a variety of ways. But the truth is that, first of all, ideology, right? To my knowledge, there are no courses in GIMO and other places on managed democracy, right? Like there were in Marxist Leninists and so on. There are certain, maybe Seliger is a kind of summer attempt to do that, but it's still not the same. Secondly, if we accept that sort of label, in a way we are already giving in the control of the agenda. It's somebody else would be defining this. We are not in conflict. NATO's policy is clear. Let me say it again, because there was lots of interesting things said during those 2 days. NATO's approach to Russia today is the 3 Ds, right? It's defense, deterrence, and dialogue. And there are reasons for each one of them. But this setting of the agenda is important, because if we start defining our differences with Russia through the prism of some kind of ideology, I think frankly, we would be doing a disservice to the Russian people. Because, one difference between what the Cold War was like and what's difference today is that if there was a change of policy, which is what NATO, EU, and the rest, I think, of the Western community would like to see, were to happen, you wouldn't have to change everything in Russia, because Russia has changed already in some respects. It is the policies that this contemporary Russia is undertaking vis-à-vis Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, its militarization, its adventurous policy towards Crimea, the Skripal affair, let's not forget about this, and various other things that we all criticize. But at the bottom of this is that the world has moved on, and we don't want to come back to the old world. So it calls for a balanced, firm, determined, but pretty also conscious of the fact that this is 2018 and we don't want to go back to, say, 1958. And one example of this is the exercise which started 1 minute after midnight today in Norway, which is the biggest exercise of NATO since 1990. The previous one was 55,000. And it is big by our standards. It focuses on all the domains, military domains, including cyber, but it is a purely defensive exercise. And we want to make sure that everybody understands it, because we do not want any misunderstanding of that nature to lead to any sort of conflict. So the point I'm making is I agree with a lot of things that you've said, but if you ask me what is the NATO's position, I'm leaving aside my own personal experiences in Russia. That's a different topic. It is what it is, and I felt I needed to say it because of various discussions which took place here over the last 2 days.
Anybody wants to see the intellectual sparring at its best, I would suggest you look at the YouTube videos of Robert's appearance on Russian state television, where they thought they were inviting him on television to beat him up, but they had no idea whom they were getting into the ring with. Vigatis, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Yes. I would like to turn to you now. I mean, Lithuania is a frontline state in every way in this conflict. How does it look from Vilnius? What are we fighting about? And what's at stake?
I'll speak not only from the perspective of Vilnius, but also from the perspective of the EU28, having finished my job a year ago in Moscow, by stating that we are in the condition of hybrid war since 2013. And let's be honest about it. What's happening in Donbass, with illegal annexation of Crimea, but not only of that. Why is that happening? And here I would like to provoke a further thought, which is the following. It is not only about the clash of the worldviews, and that was my first telegram I sent in the summer of 2013, that this profound clash of the worldviews between Russia and the West is going to accompany us for the next 10, 12 years. It is about the free choice of countries like Ukraine and Georgia to associate with the West. It is about freedoms, individual freedoms of the Russians, and how to perceive differently the state-citizens relationship. It's also about, which I think we cannot underestimate, is about survival of Putin's kleptocracy regime, which Celeste has defined, I believe, 10 or 12 years ago. Because that's what it stands in the core of his all aggression and hybrid warfare. Because he uses war with the aim to defend, protect, and secure his system, the hostage of the kleptocracy system he has created. And he's doing that in a very, with all due respect, effective way. He's brainwashing Russian people by controlling the media scale in Russia. He's antagonizing Europeans within ourselves. He's trying to disrupt and erode liberal democracy from within and from outside. And he's trying to drive the wedge between Europeans, as it was in the case we have heard today already on the different views with respect to the Nord Stream 2, and certainly he's happy to see the tensions through the Atlantic Ocean. And that's why he also engaged himself in Syria, not only to project his national defense interests or military interests, but also to get Americans on the table, next to the table, which he succeeded to get the previous US administration to talk to him about Syria and to freeze Ukraine conflict. So at the bottom of the entire domain of different factors of the hybrid warfare, his survival stands at the very core. And that's why he's going to do everything possible not to let Ukraine to become a modern country. He will use what I call the golden share of the conflict in Donbass to distract the attention of Kiev on the economic modernization needs, and also to spoil Ukraine's aspirations vis-a-vis the European Union. So our response is threefold. It's about resilience, what Bobo has spoken, because our weaknesses and loopholes are used for Putin regime to demonstrate to our society, but also to his society, to the Russian society, that the Western model is not attractive, it's not sustainable. Secondly, it's about deterrence, and that's why we need to invest in defense. That's why we need to have American troops on the ground in the Baltics because what Putin respects is American military force. And the third is also about dialogue. Dialogue with the Russians. Dialogue about the future relationships between the West and Russia after Putin's regime is gone, and maintaining the bridges with students, what the EU has been doing, expanding the Erasmus Plus program, expanding the talks and the second track talks with Russian expert community, and with a view to engage them about different scenarios. But at the end of the day is going to be Ukraine's success, which may have a profound impact into the Russian mentality, and I hope Ilya agrees on that, because if Ukraine changes, that will inject the thought among the Russians, why we're different? Can't we be a normal people and talking and working with Europeans? And that's going to be this few-fold strategy. Resilience of our economic political system, deterrence of our societies politically and militarily, and also dialogue and support for Ukraine.
And I would argue he's not only trying to protect a corrupt system, he's trying to export that corrupt system first to the former Soviet states and later to us. If corruption is indeed the new communism, Ukraine is the new Berlin in a lot of ways. Ilya, did you want to jump in very quickly here, or did you want to come to do you want to come after the end? Okay, I want to turn now to Celeste, because you've seen this. As somebody who was helping formulate the foreign policy of the Obama administration, you saw this from both ends. You saw the reset days when we had high hopes of good relations with Russia, and you saw it toward the end of the administration, when relations were probably at their low point since the end of the Cold War. How does this look from your perspective? What are we fighting about, and what's at stake?
Thanks very much, Brian. Thanks to my co-panelists, and thank you to the organizers, Zbigniew and Katarzyna, for inviting me to this wonderful event, and for the honor of serving on this closing panel, especially given our memory of Jim Denton. That's lovely. I want to propose that what this is really about is power, and in particular, a historic power transition, a period of power transition. And that the key element from an American perspective, looking at the challenge of what some have called a new Cold War, others don't want to call a new Cold War, is that we're facing a future of a rising China, a declining Russia, and a persistent challenge of global extremism connected to terrorism. And that periods of power transition historically have always been the most dangerous. And sort of counterintuitively, the countries you most have to worry about during a power transition as it's happening are the declining powers, because most systemic and world wars have actually been wars between a declining power and its potential competitors, while also laying the groundwork for managing the rising power. And so the challenge for American foreign policy is, how do we over the next decade manage our own power, our leadership in the liberal global order, which is under attack, and I'll come back to that in a second, in order to prevent a rising China from being destructive and hurting global interests, but American and allied interests, while also managing a revisionist, revanchist, and I would say now reckless Russian declining power, the decline of which will play out over several decades, probably, because great powers don't disappear overnight, unless they are destroyed in an epic world war, which is, I think, unlikely for reasons we can also talk about, while also managing the need and the responsibility to root out and protect ourselves and our allies and the global system from violent extremism, and in particular in its form of terrorism. And I would just refer to a few points, because they've already been made extremely well, that the reason why Russia and China are in a tactical partnership in fighting America as China rises and Russia manages or resists and seeks to prevent its own decline is because the rules of the liberal international order, which are so in the interests of the United States because they they support freedom, exchange, competition, transparency, transnationalism, all the things that make our economies rich, our societies healthy and progressive, and that have laid at the heart of the transatlantic relationship. All of those elements of the liberal order threaten political control at home, not only in Moscow, but also in Beijing. Now, China has a very different approach to challenging the global order. They're much more subtle. They incrementally change and sort of don't get attention, whereas the Kremlin seems to have a much more, break the dishes approach to changing global order. But they are tactically aligned in opposing that global order that helps sustain the United States and its alliances, because we share our interests and our values in the rules of, being advanced through that global order. So I don't think it, and no one here on the panel has said this, but I often hear the sort of, you have to choose whether you're going to deal with the rising China or a newly difficult Russia. The United States does not have the luxury, and frankly will not choose between taking care of those two challenges. And you've seen that reflected in the new national security strategy and the national defense strategy, that both Russia and China are named as strategic competitors that need to be dealt with, along with the challenge of countering terrorism. And in order, I would argue, and this is the thought I want to leave you with, and then I really want to hear what all these wonderful participants at the conference have to contribute, is that the United States cannot manage either a rising China nor a resurgent and revanchist and revisionist and reckless Russia without our allies, and without, in particular, the transatlantic alliance, but also our alliances throughout Asia. Because it's the alliances that allow us to act more effectively with greater military power, but also the power of those rules and institutions and values, and the appeal of the model that we offer to the international community of societies that are prosperous and open and flexible and welcoming. The United States can't do that alone. And so in order to deal with this power transition, we need the transatlantic community and we need the transatlantic alliance. So don't make us choose. Join us in managing this power transition to preserve our values and our interests and our citizens' way of life.
Thank you, Celeste. And I am informed by the organizers that we do have 10 minutes we didn't expect, so we will certainly have plenty of time for questions. And I know Iliad very much wanted to have a very brief intervention before I go to the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I just think that we shouldn't make this mistake, what many analysts are making, and saying, okay, so present-day Russia doesn't have the ideology, it's not global, it's a weak economy. The logic of Putin is different. And the ideology exists. This ideology called kleptocracy is being exported. It's a global ideology. Putin openly proclaimed himself in 2015 in his UN speech as a protector of all dictators and kleptocrats of the world. It was an open invitation. In the situation of war with Ukraine, people of Russia got poorer. People of Donbass got poorer. People of Ukraine got poorer. But the certain people in Russia, certain people from the former Yanukovych administration which lost their power in Ukraine, and certain people in the modern Ukraine, they got richer because of that war and because of Putin's actions. And what is happening right now in Syria, what is happening right now in Central African Republic, what are the preparations in Libya, it's exactly the same thing. And that's why this is way, way, way more dangerous than the emergence of Chinese influence. Because China is working for the national interest of China. So those interests are predictable. They can be balanced, they can be contained, they can be discussed. The interests that Putin administration is exporting are the personal interests. And they can always be done and realized in the situation when ordinary people of the certain areas in the world getting poorer, while those guys getting richer, and this is the power of that ideology.
Yeah, no, Ilya, I would agree with all of that, and I think we're basically looking at what I like to call an ideological kleptocracy, or a kleptocratic imperialist state. You have a criminal conspiracy masquerading as a state with an imperial ideology, and I think this is the way to look at Russia, and it's the way, if you understand Putin's background, with the combination of the KGB background and the involvement with Russian organized crime in the 90s, you see where this socialization took place. We have 15 minutes and 42 seconds. Bobo, you want? Okay,
Yeah,
one more before we
one.
go to the floor.
I just think that there is ideological conflict, except that the ideological landscape is much more complex than communism versus capitalism. Clearly, that's not the ideological conflict today. Now, Ilya mentioned kleptocracy. That is an ideology of sorts, but there's also an ideational side of it, which is authoritarian nationalism versus liberal internationalism. And the authoritarian nationalism that Putin looks at is really based on actually mid-19th century, the sort of the triad of orthodoxy. So he relies on these sort of kind of the fig leaf of moral, patriotic values. He emphasizes Russian greatness, and of course he emphasizes autocracy. He is the autocrat. It's no mistake that people around him, people like Margarita Simonyan, head of RT, talk about him as vozhd. And vozhd here is not just any ruler, it's the ruler. It's almost a millennial ruler, last applied as, in connection with Stalin.
Yeah, no, I would argue that the kleptocratic element appeals to elites. That attracts world elites to Putinism because we're not going to bug you with this rule of law, transparency stuff. You can steal all you want, just be loyal to us. What you call the vozhdism or the illiberal nationalism appeals to wedges within our own society and to the masses. I think you have a double track thing. We have 13 minutes and 58 seconds, so I do want to go out to the audience for question. The gentleman over here, we'll take a couple at a time. I would like to request that everybody keep their questions brief and that you have a question mark at the end. Please, questions, not interventions.
Sure. Grzegorz Kostrzywa, Zorbas Military University of Technology, Warsaw, Poland. Does Russia have allies? China is not an ally, according to Dr. Law. Who are the allies of Russia willing, ready, for example, to go to war with the West together with Russia? Thank you.
Hello. Good evening. My name is Raleigh Wilson. From the New Security Leaders in the United States. We've talked a lot this week about defining what this problem is, and it's clear there is competition across the board, not only on a military sense, but this ideological type spectrum. Just curious, what are anybody's recommendations on the panel on addressing these issues, not just from a defense or national security perspective, but how do we integrate other things, other policy issues that aren't traditionally integrated in national security context, something like education, for example?
Question aimed at Bobo and at Brian, who jumped in to agree with him. Why do you insist that we Western societies need to fix our domestic shortcomings in order to be effective in defending ourselves against these threats, when with all our shortcomings we are much more decent behaviors on the international stage and much more decent societies at home? And in the past, when we faced Nazism and when we faced the Cold War, our domestic shortcomings were that much more grievous than they are today. And surely you wouldn't have advocated that we shouldn't have defended ourselves back then until these domestic shortcomings were all resolved.
I guess I could tackle that one right away. I mean, we are far from perfect. And one of the things that Putin is doing is he's holding up a mirror to our own weaknesses. Yes, we're good. We're good, but we ain't perfect. And I would argue that since the end of the Cold War, we've gotten a little bit self-satisfied and complacent, and I think we need to pay a little bit more attention to making our institutions more responsive. I think we have to pay a lot more attention to accountability and transparency, especially in the realm of finance. Vladimir Putin did not invent money laundering. He did not invent offshore. He did not invent shell companies. But yet he is using these things. He has weaponized these things. And we are threatened, while Lithuania and Russia's neighbors may be threatened by Russia's tanks, as you go farther to the west, we're threatened by something else. It's called Russia's banks. So I say we do have to manage our own affairs a lot better, and this gets into the question about how we need to integrate things that are not traditionally considered part of security into the national security discussion. So this has to bring in law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and things like that in order to basically create what I like to call, and what we at CEPA like to call, hybrid containment. Because if we're facing a hybrid war, we need to face hybrid containment. I'd like to, Bobo, I don't know if you want to tackle the one on allies as well, because you wrote the book on Russia and its so-called allies. So.
But I just want to also come back to even with our shortcomings, we're still better in so many respects than Russia. I agree. I think most people in this room would agree. But what about people in China, India, Brazil, most of the Asia-Pacific region? They still think that we're better, but they're not so sure. Because what they see, rightly or wrongly, are abundant examples of Western hypocrisy, that the West obeys the rule of law only when it suits it. Now, a lot of these criticisms may be utterly unjustified, but the point is, so many parts of the world see that. And so, quite apart from the problems, the weaknesses that Brian has identified, we do such a bad job of selling ourselves as well. We used to think that we were much better at image making than the Russians. I would argue that that balance has really radically shifted in recent times. On allies, Russia essentially has no allies, at least if you understand it in the conventional sense. So if Russia were falling apart, would a bunch of countries, or indeed any country, come to its rescue? Would the Chinese, for example, engage in join Russia in countering the West in, say, the Baltic states or Eastern Europe? Absolutely not. Equally, the Chinese, the Russians, if the Chinese got involved in a confrontation in the Western Pacific, they'd stay well clear of that. So, but maybe we should be looking at alliances and allies and strategic partners in more fluid sense. There are people who are relatively well disposed to Russia, countries that are relatively well disposed, but to certain tactical ends. The Russia-China may not seem as transactional as some relationships, but ultimately it's all about business. It's not, in other words, certainly not an allied relationship.
On the domestic reform piece, I would also add that one of the things that's ailing the West right now is you have a large section of the population that feels left out. They've been left out in the globalization party. We've seen this movie before. It happened in the 30s and 40s. And we took care of that problem with good domestic politics, which also provided for our security. Celeste, did you want to get in?
The issue about education, it's a great example, and it connects to the point about containment. One of the, our moderator didn't get us down the rabbit hole of new Cold War, not Cold War, and having a debate about that. One of the reasons I don't like that frame is because if that's the diagnosis, then the prescription is containment. And I think containment actually is entirely counterproductive in the current global system, where change comes from, where engagement comes from, is by keeping our societies open. We don't want to contain Russian society. We want Russian students to come to Europe, to the United States, anywhere they're interested in getting an education. Same with Chinese students. There's a big debate now in the United States. Is it so good we have so many students from China, the Confucius Institutes and all this? those are the seeds of change, and that's how those societies will change and become progressive and modern, is through education. So even though we don't want to put education in a security box because then it looks threatening, it is part of a strong national and international policy, because I'm sure everyone in this room in one way or another has participated in some kind of exchange, and it really transformed their life and helped them see a bigger possibility. And that's something we need to keep open, and that's the problem with a frame of containment. So I agree that the old containment frame is actually counterproductive, and you gave a great example of why.
Yeah, I also wanted to reflect on the question with allies. Because, again, if we are talking about Russia as a country, I wouldn't say there are much of true allies. There are countries where we have better relations, Armenia, Hungary, but Venezuela, of course, but Iran. But even with Belarus, you cannot call them allies in the Western understanding of this word. But if we compare allies of Kremlin, there would be a way larger number of people than allies of the White House, especially modern-day White House. And this is where the danger is, because those connections, they are not visible in the media. And that's why one of the most aggressive actions, how Putin took it against Russia Federation, was publishing the Panama Papers. Because he took it like it's an act of sabotage against Russia, against Kremlin. And it was really his perception. And that's also the reason why I think that such thing as economic sanctions against Russia, sectoral sanctions, they are virtually inefficient. But personal sanctions against representatives of Russian elite are as efficient can be. And the most disruptive thing that happened to Kremlin during the last couple of years were sanctions against Deripaska and Vekselberg, because they send a very powerful message what can happen with every single of Putin's cronies. And it threatened not just people inside Russia, but also those allies outside the country.
We have 3 minutes and 49 seconds, probably time for one more round of questions.
Yes. Sorry, I'm eager to say something, so I fight for it. And that's exactly what we should be doing. If there's a common thread, when I saw the questions and the comments, if you like, from Mr. Moravchik, thank you for observation, education, and this allies. For me, it's this. It's actually a policy prescription. Yes, I might have disagreed, I do, about this label Cold War, but I do not disagree. We are dealing with the country that wants to confront us. And first thing is realization of this, self-awareness. I think we are almost there. I say almost because I think, you know, people representing civil society, academia, etc., have done a great job with this. I think there's still quite a bit left. You know, anybody who follows Private Eye? Does anybody read Private Eye? Strongly recommend. Excellent report on the role of the city in this, the men in suit, the role they have played. But one word which comes to my mind is one thing we should not be doing is defeatism, which for me means that, yes, I go back to this, we cannot allow the agenda to be set. Ilya, you're right. There are people dying and there's kleptocracy and all the rest of it. But we have all the arguments. Even if we do not manage to reform ourselves, that is impossible. And, you know, we have to reform ourselves and do better in a variety of ways because we need to do for ourselves. But, for example, the question of the allies. There are some, what kind of allies they are, right? The allies who are more afraid of Russia than the NATO countries. I think the only country which put its forces on alert during Zapad exercise was Kazakhstan. And you only need to ask our Belarusian friends if they think that everything is so hunky-dory, and so on. So my point is, and that's the point I wanted to make, is that, you know, we have, it's not a feeling of superiority, but we do have all the arguments from the economic, from the political, frankly, not to mention small things like the rule of law, etc., right? Famous case, two Russian oligarchs want to fight it out among themselves. Well, they won't go to a court in St. Petersburg, they'll go to, you know, Amsterdam, Berlin, etc. We know all this. But the thing is, we also have to do things which require response when it comes to the hard issues, because that's, that involves investment, and that means defense, that means education, for example. How do you deal with the problem of disinformation, etc.? It's a big topic. There is no time to develop. But again, one message is last point. Our unity is the biggest capital we have. And please, Ilya, with all due respect, when you use words like hypocrisy, be careful, because there have been certain achievements which should not be sort of sniffed at. Without that solidarity, we would not have a lot of things that you yourself mentioned and praised.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think we have to reinvigorate our own sense of confidence and trust. We're much stronger economically, we're much more stronger militarily. What we need next to the unity Robert was saying within the EU and between the US and the EU, also a strategy towards Russia. Not only a policy, reactionary policy, which we are now pursuing, but a strategy. What do we want to see in our relations with Russia? How can we shape different Russia? And in Moscow there is a lot of uncertainty, anxiousness, and nervousness. It's not about like in our countries. We know what to expect after 5 years. We're going to have new democratic elections. Someone will come into power and will respect the choice of the electorate. Russians don't know what's going to happen. The elites, the oligarchs are so nervous what's going to happen, and there are few fold Russia. So what they are looking for a signal and for the strategy of the West, what kind of alternative relationship they may have, if things change internally.
Thank you. And in conclusion, I'd like to thank Kasia and Zbigniew for organizing yet another wonderful Warsaw Security Forum, and join me in giving this great panel a round of applause.